Bosnia is on the brink of collapse, and a civil war could break out at any moment. This whole mess started when a top politician got convicted and sentenced to jail for a year. That man is Milorad Dodik, the president of Republika Srpska, the Serb-majority region of Bosnia. He's been stirring trouble for years. For example, he's been blocking national institutions, rejecting court rulings, and passing laws in Republika Srpska that go against Bosnia's constitution. He even tried to cut off Bosnia's state agencies from operating in his region, saying that Republika Srpska doesn't have to follow Bosnia's rules anymore. That's a huge problem, because Bosnia's constitution doesn't allow any region to just declare itself independent. But Dodik didn't care. Even in 2023, he pushed through a law that basically erased the authority of Bosnia's state courts and the International High Representative. That's when the international community stepped in, with the High Representative canceling his laws and Bosnia's state court ordering him to comply. Instead of backing down, Dodik signed the laws again, telling Bosnia's government to get lost. That's what got him into legal trouble. Bosnia's state prosecutor charged him with undermining the constitutional order, and now he's been hit with a 1-year prison sentence and a 6-year ban from office. Instead of backing down, he's going all in, defying the court, rallying his supporters, and openly pushing for Republika Srpska to break away from Bosnia. And that's where things get dangerous. Because if he actually tries to go through with it, Bosnia won't just sit back and let it happen. But here's what most people aren't talking about. No politician picks a fight this big unless they know they've got backup. If Dodik was truly on his own, he'd have been a fool to go this far. And that's where Vladimir Putin steps in. Just like Serbia, Russia is fully behind Dodik. Putin is actively fueling the crisis, promising to defend Republika Srpska's so-called sovereign rights. So, naturally, the international community is on high alert. Western diplomats are warning that the crisis is the biggest threat to Bosnia's fragile peace since the 1990s war. Christian Schmidt, the High Representative overseeing Bosnia's peace, told the UN back in 2021 that if Bosnian Serb separatism isn't curbed, the country could fall apart and conflict could return. Those warnings have only gotten louder as Dodik keeps pushing the limits. The United States and the European Union have slapped sanctions on Dodik, accusing him of trying to dismantle the Dayton Peace Agreement, the deal that ended Bosnia's brutal war in the 90s. But he doesn't seem to care. Like I said, he's not fighting this battle alone. Serbia's president, Aleksandar Vučić, and Hungary's prime minister, Viktor Orban, are both standing behind him, calling the whole case a political witch hunt. And then there's Russia as well. But the problems for Bosnia didn't just start with Dodik. The real conflict has been simmering for decades. In fact, some of these disputes go all the way back to Bosnia's ethnic divisions and a flawed peace deal. Yes, Dayton Peace Agreement stopped the war, but it didn't fix Bosnia's political structure. The country was left divided, fragile, and barely functioning as one state. And now, those cracks that were papered over are wide open for everyone to see. To really understand what's happening today, you have to go back to the 1990s. Back to when Yugoslavia collapsed, and Bosnia became the battleground for one of Europe's bloodiest wars. Yugoslavia used to be a multi-ethnic federation made up of several republics, including Bosnia and Herzegovina. But after the Cold War ended, the whole thing just started falling apart. In 1991, Slovenia and Croatia declared independence, setting off a chain reaction of conflicts. Then came Bosnia. Bosnia had a mix of Bosniaks, the Muslims, Serbs, and Croats, and when it held a referendum in 1992 to break away from Yugoslavia, things exploded. Bosnian Serb leaders, backed by neighboring Serbia, refused to accept Bosnia's independence. Instead, they wanted to carve out an ethnically pure Serb republic inside of Bosnia. At the time, Bosnian Croat forces, with support from Croatia, had their own ambitions, trying to take control of certain territories. Caught in the middle were the Bosniaks, who were just trying to hold together Bosnia, or at least defend their own communities. What followed was the deadliest conflict in Europe since World War II. From 1982 to 1995, Bosnia was torn apart by war, ethnic cleansing, and massacres. Serb forces led by Radovan Karadzic and General Ratko Mladic laid siege to the capital, Sarajevo, for nearly 4 years, bombarding civilians and sniping at anyone who dared to step outside. Entire towns were wiped out, and the world watched in horror as images surfaced from the Serb-run concentration camps like Omaska. But the worst atrocity came in July 1995, when Bosnian Serb troops stormed the UN safe area of Srebrenica and systematically murdered around 8,000 Bosniak men and boys, a massacre that would later be recognized as a genocide. Meanwhile, the Bosniaks and the Croats also turned against each other, breaking into open warfare in 1993, particularly in Herzegovina. The fighting only stopped when the US brokered a ceasefire in 1994, forcing the Bosniaks and the Croats to team up against the Bosnian Serbs. But by the time the guns fell silent in 1995, over 100,000 people had been killed, and more than 2 million had been displaced. Nearly every family in Bosnia carries scars from this war. The war finally ended in late 1995, not because the sides wanted peace, but because of international pressure and military force. After NATO airstrikes against Bosnian Serb forces, the warring parties were dragged to Dayton, Ohio for peace talks. The result was the Dayton Peace Agreement, signed in December of 1995. It stopped the war, but it also locked Bosnia into a deeply complicated political system. Under Dayton, Bosnia remained one country, but it was internally split into two separate entities. One was the Republika Srpska, the Serb-controlled region, covering 49% of the country, and the other is the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a Bosnia-Croat shared territory, covering the remaining 51%. On paper, Sarajevo remained the undivided capital, but in reality, power was heavily decentralized. Each entity got to govern itself with its own laws, police, and political structure. Bosnia's national government, based in Sarajevo, was weak by design, barely holding the country together. And then there was the tripartite presidency, a bizarre system where Bosnia had 3 presidents, one Bosniak, one Serb, and one Croat, each taking turns leading the country. The constitution itself wasn't even written by Bosnians. It was literally an annex of the Dayton Peace Agreement. Bosnia, in many ways, was a peace deal first and a country second. To keep everything from falling apart, Dayton also created the position of High Representative, an international office with sweeping powers to enforce the peace. Backed by major world powers, this person could impose laws, fire politicians, and block any moves that threatened Bosnia's stability. In short, Bosnia wasn't just ruled by its own leaders. It had a foreign overseer, making sure that war didn't break out again. And just in case anyone tried to start another war, NATO deployed tens of thousands of troops to keep the peace. Over time, this force was replaced by an EU-led peacekeeping mission, but foreign troops never really fully left Bosnia. In the years after the war, Bosnia tried to rebuild itself under heavy international supervision. Refugees and displaced families started returning to homes now controlled by other ethnic groups, something that tested nerves on all sides. At the same time, the Office of High Representative, the OHR, was actively reshaping Bosnia's political system. High representatives had sweeping authority, and they did not hesitate to use it. Throughout the late 1900s and early 2000s, they removed politicians deemed obstructionist and forced through reforms meant to unify Bosnia as a state. A single national currency was introduced, and in 2001 through 2002, Bosnia's once separate ethnic armies were merged into one single national military. They had one simple goal: to strengthen central institutions and prepare Bosnia for eventual integration into the EU and NATO. On paper, this seemed like progress, but underneath, the deep ethnic grievances from the war had never really gone away. Bosnian Serb leaders accepted the Dayton Agreement mainly because it gave them Republika Srpska, RS, as an autonomous entity. To them, Dayton confirmed RS's equal standing with the central government, and it made it clear that any attempt to give more power to Sarajevo would be treated as a direct attack on Serb rights. For Bosniaks, it was the opposite. They had always seen Dayton as a temporary fix, a necessary compromise just to stop the war, but not a permanent solution. Their hope was that, over time, Bosnia would reintegrate into a stronger, more centralized state. For many Bosniaks, the very existence of the Republika Srpska was a painful reminder of ethnic cleansing, a part of Bosnia that, in their eyes, never should have been allowed to exist as a separate entity. With one side pushing for more centralization and the other fighting to preserve autonomy, Bosnia's government quickly became a bureaucratic nightmare. The country is still often called the world's most complex democracy, with layer upon layer of ethnic-based institutions that make passing even the simplest laws a struggle. By the mid-2000s, the international community faced a dilemma. Either they kept running Bosnia from above, or start handing over real power to local politicians. In 2006, there was a serious push to reform Bosnia's constitution, the so-called April Package, which aimed to make the central government more effective. The proposal actually had broad support for Bosniaks, Croats, and even moderate Serbs, but it fell apart in parliament by just a few votes. And that failure changed everything. When the April package failed, it really fired up the hardliners in Republika Srpska, especially Milorad Dodik. Up until then, Dodik had been seen as a moderate. In fact, when he first took power in RS in 1998, he had Western support because he wasn't as extreme as the wartime Serb leaders. But by the mid-2000s, he had completely transformed into the loudest voice of Serb nationalism in Bosnia. Since 2006, Dodik and his SNSD party have dominated Republika Srpska's politics, and he has used every opportunity to weaken Bosnia's central institutions. His message has always been clear, that if Bosnia doesn't respect Republika Srpska's autonomy, RS will just leave altogether. Over the years, he has repeatedly threatened to hold an independence referendum, calling Bosnia an artificial creation, and openly suggesting that RS's real future is with Serbia, not Bosnia. One of the first major flashpoints came in 2016, when Republika Srpska held a national holiday referendum. The holiday in question was January 9th, the date in 1992 when Bosnian Serbs declared their breakaway republic, setting the stage for the war. Bosnia's constitutional court ruled that celebrating this day as an official holiday was unconstitutional, basically saying it was offensive to non-Serbs. Dodik held a referendum anyway. 99.8% of Serbs who voted chose to keep celebrating the holiday, in direct defiance of the court's ruling. This was a major challenge to Bosnia's legal system, and it got strong reactions. The EU and the United States condemned it. Even Serbia's leadership at the time distanced itself from the move, but Russia stood by Dodik. That referendum wasn't about the holiday. It was a test. Dodik wanted to see how far he could go in ignoring Bosnia's institutions, and he learned an important lesson, that international backlash was weak, and nobody stopped him. From that moment, he started to push even harder. By the late 2010s, Dodik had turned obstructionism into an art form. Instead of pushing for outright independence, he started slowly chipping away at Bosnia's unity by blocking state-level decisions. In 2017 and 2018, he threatened to pull RS representatives out of Bosnia's armed forces and form an RS army in response to legal disputes over military property. In 2019, after a court ruling transferred public land from RS to the central government, Dodik again threatened to withdraw RS from all state institutions. His strategy was clear. Whenever Bosnia's courts or international bodies made a ruling he didn't like, he would threaten to take Republika Srpska out of the system entirely. While these crises were always resolved through negotiations, Dodik kept pushing the limits, and each time he got away with it. Among Bosnian Serbs, he cemented his image as the ultimate defender of RS, but for Bosniaks and Western officials, he became the biggest destabilizing force in Bosnia, someone who kept dragging the country closer to collapse. While Dodik made headline after headline, Bosnia's other political problems kept mounting. The Bosnian Muslims community is the largest ethnic group in Bosnia, and the one most supported of a united, multi-ethnic country. But internal politics among Bosniaks have been a mess. For decades, the SDA, the main Bosniak party, has always been at odds with both Serb and Croat leaders over how Bosnia should function. Unlike Serbs and Croats, Bosniaks don't have a neighboring country to back them, so they've always relied on international support like the OHR, the EU, NATO, and the US to keep Bosnia together. But this reliance also bred frustration. Western officials often turned a blind eye to Dodik's provocations, and Bosniak leaders felt like they were constantly fighting alone to defend Bosnia's unity. Meanwhile, ordinary people were growing disillusioned with all of Bosnia's politicians as corruption, economic stagnation, and mass emigration of young people worsened every year. Similarly, even the Bosnian Croats, the smallest of the three main ethnic groups, have had their own frustrations. They mostly live in the Federation, sharing cantons with Bosniaks, and many feel like they lack any real political power. One major issue has been the Bosnian presidential elections. Since the Federation elects one Bosniak and one Croat, and Bosniaks outnumber Croats by a huge margin, Bosniak voters have often helped elect Croat representatives who weren't hardline nationalists. Croat leaders like Dragan Kojic have called this unfair and demanded a new electoral system, even floating the idea of a third Croat majority entity within Bosnia. This has created tensions between Bosniaks and Croats. At its core, Bosnia's political system has been barely holding together for decades. Serbs want less Bosnia, Bosniaks want more Bosnia, and Croats want guarantees that they won't be sidelined. And Dodik has used all of this instability to fuel his claims that Bosnia doesn't work. And it never will. By mid-2021, Bosnia's fragile political balance took a hard turn towards collapse. That summer, Valentin Inzko, the outgoing international high representative, imposed a new law banning genocide denial and the glorification of war criminals. The law was a response to widespread Bosnian Serb denial of the Srebrenica genocide, and continued celebrations of figures like Radovan Karadzic. For Milorad Dodik, this was the perfect excuse to escalate his long-standing fight against Bosnia's central government. He outright rejected the law and refused to enforce it in Republika Srpska, and took it a step further by announcing that RS would stop cooperating with Bosnia's national institutions altogether. By autumn of 2021, RS representatives completely boycotted Bosnia's government, grinding decision-making to a halt. Then Dodik upped the stakes even further. He revealed plans to strip away RS from Bosnia's shared institutions, announcing laws that would create a specific RS army, intelligence service, judiciary, and tax authority. In other words, he was reversing decades of state building and effectively laying the groundwork for secession. Christian Schmidt, the new High Representative who took office in 2021, warned in a report to the UN that Dodik's actions were tantamount to secession without proclaiming it, and that this was the biggest threat to Bosnia's existence since the 1990s war. For most of 2022, Bosnia was stuck in political paralysis. Dodik, facing pressure from Serbia and some EU diplomats, temporarily held off creating an RS army. But he pushed ahead with other moves, setting up a separate RS drug enforcement agency and an RS judicial council, asserting full autonomy over Republika Srpska's courts. By late 2022, tensions eased a bit when Bosnia held its general elections, which Dodik won comfortably, reclaiming his position as president of Republika Srpska. But by early 2023, he was back on the offensive, this time launching an even bolder legal attack against Bosnia's institutions. The tipping point came in May of 2023, when Republika Srpska's parliament passed new laws that outright rejected the authority of Bosnia's constitutional court and the High Representative. This meant that no decision made in Sarajevo would be recognized in RS territory. This was a blatant violation of the Dayton Peace Agreement, which explicitly states that the rulings of Bosnia's constitutional court are binding across the entire country. This was a direct challenge to the international community, and High Representative Schmidt was forced to respond. So, in July of 2023, he invoked his Bonn powers, the sweeping legal authority granted to his office, and annulled the RS laws, effectively declaring them invalid. Not only that, but he also made it a crime to ignore the High Representative's decisions, adding a 5-year prison sentence for any official who refused to comply. This was a legal line in the sand, and Dodik stepped right over it. On July 7, 2023, Dodik re-signed the nullified RS laws, publishing them in the official RS Gazette, and publicly defied Schmidt's authority. That was the final straw. Bosnia's state prosecutor filed criminal charges against Dodik in August of 2023, accusing him of undermining the country's constitutional order. Suddenly, what had been a political crisis turned into a legal war between Bosnia and Dodik himself. Dodik turned his trial into a political weapon. He portrayed himself as a martyr for the Serb people, claiming the charges were a plot by Bosniak politicians and foreign occupiers to destroy Republika Srpska. His government and media went all in on this narrative. He held mass rallies urging Serbs to reject Sarajevo's rule. But it's also important to keep in mind that not all Serbs backed him. Even within RS, opposition leaders saw Dodik's move as reckless. The Serb opposition SDS party called out Dodik's tactics as self-serving, arguing that he was dragging Republika Srpska into a crisis just to save his own political career. Some of Dodik's own allies were privately worried about the economic fallout, as RS faced rising debt and investor uncertainty. Still, Dodik pressed forward, knowing that his political survival depended on keeping the fight alive. By February of 2025, the trial reached its explosive conclusion. The Bosnian state court found Dodik guilty. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison and banned from office for 6 years. This was huge, because until now, no top RS leader had ever been convicted for defying Bosnia's constitutional order. Dodik, of course, refused to acknowledge the ruling. Neither he nor his lawyers even showed up for the sentencing. Instead, he staged a massive rally in Banja Luka, Republika Srpska's capital, where he declared that Bosnia, as a state, was dead to him. Things escalated even further when Republika Srpska's institutions rushed to protect Dodik from the verdict. The RS parliament, now completely dominated by Dodik's allies, passed a law declaring the state's court ruling null and void inside of Republika Srpska. The RS president, Dodik himself, despite the ruling, signed it into law on March 5th, 2025. RS police and local authorities flat out refused to enforce any arrest. An RS police chief even said they could not receive such orders, leaving the matter to Bosnia's national police, who have little presence in RS. At this point, Dodik was openly daring Sarajevo to try and remove him by force, something that could trigger an armed confrontation between Bosnian state police, backed by international forces, and RS security forces, loyal to Dodik. On March 12, 2025, Bosnia state prosecutor took the step by issuing a formal arrest warrant for Dodik and his top associates after they ignored court summons. But Dodik, he just laughed it off In an interview, he even said, "We will not respond. If they think the solution is to see Dodik in handcuffs, that does not mean they can do it." Tellingly, that same day, Republika Srpska's assembly discussed a provocative draft RS constitution, one that would legally redefine RS as a sovereign state of the Serb people, with its own army and full right to self-determination. It wasn't adopted yet, but just floating the idea sent shockwaves through Sarajevo, the EU, and beyond. If passed, it would be the closest thing to an outright declaration of independence. And just like that, Bosnia was once again standing on the edge of collapse. The world's reaction to Bosnia's crisis has been a weird mix of diplomatic warnings, sanctions, and condemnations. In simple terms, there's no unified approach. On one side, the United States and the European Union have consistently denounced Dodik's secessionist agenda, calling his actions a direct threat to the Dayton Peace Agreement and Bosnia's stability. Western officials stress the rule of law must be upheld, and no one, no matter how powerful, can override Bosnia's institutions. The US and the UK have already sanctioned Dodik before his 2025 conviction. After the verdict, Washington and Brussels praised the ruling, indirectly urging Republika Srpska's authorities to respect it. But then again, Dodik doesn't care. Because Western sanctions mainly target his foreign assets and travel, so far, they haven't hit Republika Srpska's economy hard enough to force a changing course. That's why Dodik has doubled down, betting that the West lacks either the leverage or the resolve to stop him. And to a degree, he's been proven right, especially when it comes to the European Union's internal divisions. While many EU member states want tougher action against Dodik, their efforts keep getting blocked from within. Hungary and Croatia, two EU nations with their own political agendas, have emerged as Dodik's biggest defenders in Brussels. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, a close ally of Moscow, has actively blocked stronger EU measures against Dodik. He calls the Bosnian court case a political attack on a democratically elected leader. Croatia's president, Zoran Milanovic, has also defended Dodik, arguing that the international high representative has too much power and dismissing Bosnia's political structure as a foreign-imposed system. This has infuriated Bosnia's Bosniak and pro-Bosnia politicians, who see Hungary and Croatia's stance as undermining Bosnia's unity. But there's little they can do. Any EU-wide sanctions require unanimity, and Budapest, with Zagreb's tacit backing, has repeatedly vetoed them. This means that Europe's only real tools are cutting financial aid and issuing statements, neither of which have stopped Dodik so far. On the other side, Dodik's biggest backers, Russia and Serbia, have been far more consistent in their support. For Putin, Bosnia is just another front to create new problems for the West. So to him, backing Bosnian Serb nationalism serves two key purposes. One, it disrupts NATO and EU expansion in the Balkans, so the region remains unstable and divided. Two, it gives Russia leverage over Bosnia's peacekeeping forces, which are under an EU-led mandate at the UN Security Council. That's why Russia wasted no time condemning Dodik's conviction. The Russian Foreign Ministry called the verdict fabricated and accused the West of trying to remove a legally elected leader. Moscow even got the UN Security Council to hold informal discussions on Bosnia in early 2025. Dodik, in return, has openly aligned himself with Russia. He meets regularly with Vladimir Putin, praises Moscow's support, and, most provocatively, has called on Russia to veto the renewal of the EU peacekeeping mission in Bosnia. For now, Russia hasn't gone that far, but just the threat alone sends a clear message that if Dodik needs protection, Moscow is watching. Now, Serbia is involved too, but its role is a bit more complicated. Republika Srpska was originally meant to unite with Serbia. That was the Serb nationalist goal during the 1990s war. But today, Serbia is in a tricky position. Officially, Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić supports Bosnia's borders. He has to, because Serbia signed the Dayton Agreement in 1995. But at home, Dodik is very popular among Serbian nationalists, so Vučić can't ignore him either. When Dodik was convicted, Vučić called it an attack on all Serbs, yet at the same time, he urged everyone in Bosnia to avoid conflict. His message was mixed on purpose. Serbia wants to look like it supports Dodik without fully endorsing RS's secession, because a Republika Srpska breakaway could be a nightmare for Serbia too. If RS tries to declare independence, it could reignite the Kosovo issue, forcing Serbia into a conflict it doesn't want. If Serbia fully backs Dodik, it risks heavy Western sanctions, wrecking its EU membership aspirations. So Vučić's strategy has been to show solidarity with Dodik, but never promise outright support for RS secession. It's a tightrope act, and for now, he's keeping Serbia out of the direct fight. Right now, this crisis has created clear dividing lines. Dodik, backed by Russia, Hungary, and his allies in Republika Srpska, is pushing the limits of Bosnia's fragile system. The Bosnian state, with the US, NATO, and most of the EU behind it, is trying to uphold the Dayton Agreement and keep Bosnia intact. Serbia is trying to not get dragged in, and the EU is split, with Hungary and Croatia blocking stronger action. So right now, all of them are at a dangerous stalemate, where both sides think they can outlast the other. Dodik is betting that the West is too distracted with Ukraine, internal politics, and other crises to take serious actions against him. Meanwhile, Western officials are hoping that economic pressure and the fear of isolation will eventually make Dodik back down. And this all brings us back to the unthinkable question. Could Bosnia slide back into armed conflict? For many Bosnians, the idea is nightmarish. The wounds of the 1990s war are still fresh, and most ordinary people want nothing to do with another round of bloodshed. A common phrase heard across all communities is, "Nobody sane will pick up a gun again." We remember all too well what happened. Many even say that if violence erupts, they'll flee the country rather than fight. But the thing is, wars aren't always started by popular demand. They happen when political and security dynamics spiral out of control. And right now, Bosnia is flirting with that danger. So what could actually trigger violence? Who has the military power to fight? And would outside forces step in to stop it before it escalates? The quickest way violence could break out is if Republika Srpska, RS, officially tries to secede or forcefully remove Bosnia's state authority from its territory. That could happen in a few ways. RS authorities take over state-owned property like army barracks, border posts, or government-run companies. RS declares its own military and starts arming it, cutting ties with Bosnia's national defense. Any of these moves would put immense pressure on the Bosnian state and the Federation to respond. If you remember, Bosnia's constitution doesn't allow any part of the country to leave unilaterally. So if RS pushed for independence, it would be seen by many in the Federation as an act of war. The first major flashpoint would likely be the strategic Brčko district, a small but crucial strip of neutral land that connects the eastern and western halves of RS. If RS tries to take full control of Brčko, it could trigger armed clashes, as it would effectively split Bosnia in half. Another possible trigger could be the standoff over Dodik's arrest. If Bosnia State Police tried to enter RS territory to detain Dodik under the court's warrant, they could be physically blocked by RS police or even by crowds of Dodik supporters. Something like this could easily spiral into a larger fight. But what could happen is nationalist volunteers from Serbia crossing into RS, just like fighters crossed borders in the 90s to defend their people. Then there's the risk of localized ethnic violence. And finally, spontaneous protests could spiral into violence. Now back to the question, which side has a better chance to fight? Bosnia's formal military today is the Armed Forces of Bosnia and Herzegovina, a unified army with soldiers from all ethnic groups. It has a total of 10,000 active personnel with light tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery. On paper, this force is officially multi-ethnic, but now people are worried about loyalty. In RS, many Serb officers are politically empathetic to Dodik, so the question is in a crisis. Could Serb officers refuse to follow orders from Sarajevo? Dodik has previously encouraged Serb-origin soldiers to break ranks and answer to RS instead of Bosnia's national army. If RS seceded, the army could fracture along ethnic lines, essentially recreating the three wartime factions of the 1990s. RS doesn't have an official army yet, but it has built up its police force and paramilitary networks. RS special police units are heavily armed and trained in riot control and counterterrorism. Some reports also indicate that RS police have received anti-riot gear, new rifles, and armored vehicles from Russia and Serbia. Moreover, Wagner Group mercenaries were seen attending an RS parade in 2023, suggesting possible Russian influence. Serb paramilitary groups like the Chetnik movement have also become more active. Now, this isn't a match against an army, but still, these RS forces could cause some serious instability, especially if they control certain areas or engage in guerrilla-style conflict. On the other hand, the Federation Bosniak Croat doesn't have a separate entity army or police force, but they do have veteran groups that still remain strong, and many still own small arms from the war. If RS declared independence, many former Bosnian fighters could remobilize. Moreover, there are still massive stockpiles of weapons hidden in Bosnia, left over from the 1990s war. A high-ranking official once said, "There's more than enough firepower here for very bad things to happen." So what's stopping Dodik? Well, right now, the biggest deterrent to the war is the presence of foreign troops. EU FOR, aka European Union Force in Bosnia, with a size of 1,100 to 1,600 troops, mainly from Austria, Germany, France, and others, are responsible for maintaining stability, deterring violence, and supporting local forces. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the EU doubled its troop presence in Bosnia, worried that the Balkans could be Putin's next playground to cause trouble. But will the EU FOR fight if tensions keep escalating? Well, the answer is a bit complicated. As of now, EU FOR has stated clearly that its troops will not enforce political rulings, meaning they won't storm RS buildings or arrest Dodik. But if violence breaks out, they would likely intervene to separate warring sides and secure key positions like weapon depots, military bases, etc. And if things escalate further, NATO could also step in. The alliance has over-the-horizon forces, meaning troops stationed in Italy or elsewhere in Europe who could be deployed if Bosnia collapses into conflict. This brings us to the complicated part. EUFOR operates under a UN mandate that must be renewed annually. Russia has the power to veto this renewal, and guess what? Dodik has openly asked Moscow to block it. If Russia vetoes EUFOR's mandate in November, Europe might have to withdraw its troops, creating a security vacuum that Dodik would definitely exploit. At this point, Bosnia is stuck, and so are the locals and international leaders trying to contain the crisis. The country faces several possible futures, none of them ideal, but some far worse than others. The most optimistic scenario is that Bosnia avoids war but remains locked in the same useless political state. So Dodik continues to devise Bosnia's state institutions, but without outright secession or war. Instead, RS would settle into a state of de facto self-rule, with Bosnia effectively becoming Bosnia minus. Under this model, state institutions in Sarajevo would remain largely paralyzed, with RS ignoring laws and decisions it doesn't like, while Bosnia's High Representative and Constitutional Court continue striking down RS's unilateral moves, which RS in turn would refuse to recognize. It would be a legal and political stalemate, something like a frozen conflict without open fighting. The international response would likely be more sanctions. RS leaders would face increased economic pressure, and if Dodik's hardline stance starts hurting RS's economy significantly through a loss of foreign aid, investor flight, or financial restrictions, then opposition within RS itself might grow. Dodik could be removed or sidelined, either through elections or, in an extreme case, by an OHR decree using the Bonn powers. His replacement might still be a nationalist leader, but potentially one more open to compromise. This could eventually lead to a new political settlement, something like a Dayton II agreement, where some Serb and Croats grievances are addressed, but Bosnia's sovereignty remains intact. There might be reforms to the Constitutional Court, such as removing foreign judges, a long-standing Serb demand, or adjustments to election laws to appease Croat concerns. In exchange, RS would drop its secessionist push. The EU would still dangle the possibility of membership, though Bosnia's actual progress towards joining the EU would remain painfully slow due to continued political dysfunction. Bosnia might keep its EU candidate status, which it received in 2022, but as long as these internal conflicts persist, real integration would remain out of reach. This muddling through scenario means Bosnia avoids war, but remains deeply fractured. A country surviving but not thriving. In a more aggressive Western intervention scenario, the current crisis forces the US and EU to take bolder action. Instead of merely reacting, Western powers might decide to actively push Bosnia onto a more stable course. This could mean coordinated sanctions that directly hit RS's economy, cutting off business ties and foreign investments, making it economically unsustainable for RS to continue its defiance. The EU might finally overcome internal divisions and agree to condition all financial aid on rolling back RS's secessionist moves. If Dodik still refuses to back down, the High Representative could invoke his bond powers to remove him from office, barring him from politics, something that was done to lesser officials in the past. This would be a drastic step, but with strong international backing and a security presence, the risk of major unrest could be contained. Serbia's role would be crucial here. If Belgrade quietly accepted Dodik's removal, perhaps in exchange for guarantees that RS's autonomy would still be respected, it could deflate much of the resistance inside RS. Serbia might choose to prioritize its own EU ambitions rather than sacrificing everything to back Dodik's defiance. With or without Dodik, Bosnia's leadership could then engage in serious negotiations for a new political deal. RS's autonomy could be reaffirmed within Bosnia, but a new agreement could prevent constant state paralysis. At the same time, Croat concerns about election rules might be addressed, making power sharing more functional. If this scenario played out successfully, Bosnia could finally move towards real EU integration. The EU granted Bosnia candidate status in December of 2022, partly out of fear that Russia's war in Ukraine could spill instability into the Balkans. A strong Western response in Bosnia could undermine Russia's influence and reinforce Bosnia's European future. The NATO question would also come into play. Bosnia has had an open invitation to NATO's membership action plan since 2010, but RS has blocked progress for years. A renewed Western push could strengthen Bosnia's ties to NATO, though outright membership would remain politically sensitive given Serb opposition. A middle ground might be Bosnia staying militarily neutral, but deepening its cooperation with NATO and EU defense initiatives, ensuring long-term stability without inflaming Serb nationalism. This scenario means Bosnia would finally overcome its dreadful wartime memories, but it would require unity and resolve from the West. Another scenario could be a peaceful breakup of Bosnia, where RS declares independence. While this is widely rejected by Bosniak and pro-Bosnia leaders, some speculate that under extreme circumstances, an internationally mediated separation could happen. In this scenario, RS would declare independence with tacit approval from major powers. Perhaps Serbia and Russia would recognize an independent RS, while Western countries reluctantly accept to avoid a larger crisis. This would be similar to how Kosovo's independence played out, but just in reverse. This might sound good, but the consequences would be enormous. A split would require redrawing borders and potentially moving populations. Since Bosnia's communities are deeply mixed, Bosniak majority areas inside RS, like Srebrenica, would likely resist being part of an independent RS. Likewise, Serb majority areas in the Federation might want to break away. The results could be mass displacement, a new refugee crisis, and severe economic instability. Additionally, who would guarantee such a breakup? The Dayton Peace Treaty was internationally brokered. A new dissolution deal would likely need backing from the US, EU, Russia, Serbia, and Croatia. Given the current geopolitical climate, such a grand bargain seems almost impossible. Moreover, an independent RS would face economic and diplomatic isolation. It would be landlocked unless it joined Serbia, and likely under Western sanctions, cutting it off from foreign investments. Meanwhile, the Federation might remain tied to the EU, but in a weakened state, struggling to recover from the split. Right now, most Western officials and regional leaders reject this scenario outright, fearing it could destabilize the Balkans further. But if Bosnia's crisis spirals out of control, some might see partition as a last resort to prevent war. And lastly, the worst scenario is that Bosnia's crisis escalates into violence. If RS unilaterally declares independence, Bosnian forces could mobilize to stop the country's disintegration, and clashes could break out. In that case, NATO and EU would almost certainly intervene quickly to prevent a full-scale war. Unlike in 1992, when the West hesitated for years, today, Bosnia is surrounded by NATO countries. A new war would likely see a much faster military response. NATO airstrikes could target RS military positions, and peacekeeping forces could be reinforced to suppress violence. While a return to war remains unlikely, the longer Bosnia's crisis drags on, the greater the risk that tensions boil over.